You know, they say a man's home is his castle, but out here in the sweeping valleys of Montana, my home is more like a fortress built of sweat, soil, and history, a place where the fences were strung by my great-grandfather's calloused hands back in 1892, and where the dirt under my fingernails is the same dirt that covers 3 generations of Thorne men in the family plot up on the ridge. I'm Elias Thorne, and for 62 years, I have woken up every single morning to the sound of wind rushing through the ponderosa pines and the lowing of cattle on the Ironwood Creek Ranch, a 500-acre spread that has survived droughts, blizzards, the Great Depression, and market crashes. But I never thought the thing that would almost take it all away from me would be a piece of paper in a certified envelope from a group of people who think roughing it means the espresso machine at the clubhouse is broken. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of crisp, golden autumn day that makes you thank the good Lord for giving you eyes to see it. And I had just come in from checking the fence line along the eastern ridge where the woods give way to the encroaching sprawl of suburbia. My wife, Martha, who has been the steel in my spine for 40 years, was standing at the kitchen island with a look on her face that I hadn't seen since the bank threatened to call our loan back in the 80s. It was a mix of confusion and a deep, simmering anger. She handed me a thick envelope, the return address embossed in gold foil that read Serenity Heights Community Association, which is the fancy new development that popped up on the other side of the creek about 5 years ago, a place where the houses look like they were stamped out of a factory mold and the grass is so green it looks painted on. I opened it, my rough hands fumbling a bit with the delicate paper, and as I read the cover letter, the air just about left my lungs, because right there in bold, black letters, it said Notice of Delinquency and Intent to Foreclose, claiming that I, Elias Thorne, owed $54,000 in unpaid homeowners association dues, assessments, and legal fees. I laughed at first, a dry, humorless chuckle that rattled in my chest, because I thought it had to be a prank or a clerical error, seeing as how I don't live in Serenity Heights. I never signed a contract with Serenity Heights, and quite frankly, I wouldn't live in Serenity Heights if they gave me the deed to the whole plastic kingdom for free. Martha, I said, tossing the letter onto the oak table that my daddy built. This is garbage, just some computer glitch where they mixed up our parcel number with one of their cookie-cutter mansions. But Martha didn't laugh. She just pointed to the second page, which was a map, a satellite image of the area with a bright red line drawn around the Serenity Heights boundaries. And that red line, bold as brass, hooked right out and swallowed my entire ranch. The next morning, instead of riding out to check the herd, I sat in my office, which smells of old leather and pipe tobacco, and I dialed the number on that letterhead, expecting to clear this up in 5 minutes with a quick chat and maybe an apology from some embarrassed secretary. Instead, I got Brenda Sterling. Now, you have to understand, I've dealt with rattlesnakes, I've stared down a grizzly bear that was eyeing my calves, and I've negotiated with cattle buyers who would steal the gold out of your teeth, but I have never met a creature quite as cold and calculating as Brenda Sterling, the president of the Serenity Heights HOA. Her voice was sweet, sickeningly so, like syrup that's been left out in the sun too long. And when I explained that I had owned my land for decades before her subdivision was even a gleam in a developer's eye, she didn't apologize, she didn't stutter, she just hummed a little sound of condescension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Oh, Mr. Thorne," she said, and I could practically hear the fake smile through the phone. "I understand this must be a shock, but when the Serenity Heights Charter was expanded 3 years ago, the board voted to annex the adjacent unimproved parcels to protect our viewshed and maintain community standards. And since you failed to opt out during the 30-day comment period, which was posted in the basement of the county courthouse, by the way, you are legally part of our association." I gripped the phone so hard I thought the plastic might crack, my knuckles turning white, and I said, "Lady, you can vote to annex the moon for all I care, but you can't just vote to take a man's property rights away without him signing a paper. I never agreed to join your club. I don't use your pool. I don't drive on your roads. And I sure as hell am not paying you 50 grand for the privilege of breathing my own air." "Well," she replied, her voice turning from syrup to ice in a heartbeat, "that's a matter for the courts, isn't it? But I should warn you, Mr. Thorne, our bylaws allow us to foreclose on properties with significant delinquencies to recover our costs. And frankly, your farm is an eyesore that drags down our property values with all that mud and those rusted tractors. So perhaps it would be best if you just sold the land to the developer we're working with and moved to a nice condo in Florida. And there it was. It wasn't about dues. It wasn't about rules. It was a land grab, plain and simple. They wanted my 500 acres to expand their empire of beige boxes, and they were using a loophole and a mountain of fees to bully me into selling. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye because my mother raised me not to use profanity at women, even the ones who deserve it. And I sat there for a long time, looking out the window at the rolling hills that hold the memories of my father teaching me to ride and my daughter taking her first steps, and I felt a fire ignite in my belly that was hotter than a branding iron. They wanted to fight? Well, they were about to find out that you don't poke a bear in his own den, and you definitely don't try to steal a rancher's land unless you're ready to get buried in it. I drove into town that afternoon, bypassing the shiny new law firms with glass fronts and heading straight for a brick building on Main Street that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the Truman administration, the office of Samuel Vance. Old Sam has been the Thorne family attorney since before I was born, a man who wears cowboy boots with his suit and knows more about land law than any high-priced city lawyer. And when I laid that letter on his desk, he didn't gasp. He just took a sip of his lukewarm coffee, adjusted his spectacles, and let out a low whistle that sounded like a steam train leaving the station. "Elias," he said, his voice gravelly and deep. "This is the boldest, stupidest thing I have ever seen. But these HOA types, they operate on fear. They bank on the fact that regular folks can't afford to fight them, so they just pay up or sell out." He started pulling books off his shelf, dusty old tomes that smelled like vanilla and history, and he told me to go home and find everything, every deed, every survey, every tax record going back to the original Homestead Act. For the next 2 weeks, Martha and I turned the house upside down, digging through the attic, opening trunks that hadn't seen the light of day in years, and we found it. The original patent signed by the territorial governor, the surveys from the 50s, and the clear, undeniable proof that Ironwood Creek Ranch was an independent entity with no covenants, no conditions, and absolutely no connection to the land that Serenity Heights was built on. But while we were digging, I started making calls, talking to the other old-timers in the valley, guys like Jim Miller who owns the orchard down the road, and the widow Henderson who has that small horse patch near the river. Turns out, I wasn't the only one. Brenda and her vultures had sent letters to 5 other property owners, all of us bordering their development, all of us sitting on prime real estate that they wanted to get their hands on, and poor Mrs. Henderson was already packing boxes, terrified because they told her they'd take her pension if she didn't pay. That broke my heart, and then it hardened it into stone, because picking on me is one thing, but terrifying an 80-year-old widow is an act of war. We organized a meeting in my barn, sitting on hay bales and folding chairs, drinking coffee out of styrofoam cups, a motley crew of farmers, ranchers, and retirees, and I looked at their tired, worried faces and promised them that I would spend every last dime I had to bury this HOA before I let them take 1 inch of our land. Sam filed a lawsuit the next Monday, not just a defense, but a massive countersuit charging Serenity Heights with slander of title, attempted fraud, harassment, and abuse of process, and we didn't just ask for them to stop. We asked for damages. We asked for their charter to be revoked. We asked for the moon and the stars because they had tried to take our son. The months leading up to the trial were a nightmare of depositions and legal maneuvering, with Brenda's lawyers trying to bury us in paperwork, demanding to inspect my barns for environmental hazards, sending drones over my property to take pictures, which I may or may not have threatened to shoot down with birdshot, and trying to bleed us dry financially so we'd give up. But they underestimated the stubbornness of a man who has spent his life fighting the elements. I sold my prize bull. I dipped into my retirement. I did what I had to do because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about right and wrong. Finally, the day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers, but with half the town who had heard about the range war and wanted to see the outcome. Judge Harlan Ford was presiding, a man who looks like he was carved out of granite, a local legend who runs his courtroom with an iron fist and has zero patience for nonsense. Brenda was there, sitting at the plaintiff's table in a suit that probably cost more than my truck, looking smug. whispering to her team of slick lawyers who looked like they were afraid of catching something from the rustic decor of the county courthouse. Her lawyer started his opening statement with a lot of fancy words about community cohesion and shared burdens, painting the picture that I was a leech, a freeloader who benefited from the prestige of having their luxury homes next door without paying my fair share, claiming that my cows were a nuisance and my fences were an eyesore that damaged the visual integrity of the neighborhood. I sat there, gripping the arms of my chair, biting my tongue until I tasted blood, listening to him describe my life's work as blight. Then it was Sam's turn. He didn't use fancy words. He didn't pace around like a peacock. He just walked to the center of the room, holding a single piece of paper, the original land patent from 1889. "Your Honor," Sam said, his voice booming without a microphone, "Serenity Heights has existed for 5 years. The Thorne family has been on this land since before this state had a star on the flag. They claim they annexed his land. I ask you, where's the signature? Where's the agreement? Since when does a club get to force you to join just because they moved in next door?" The trial dragged on for 3 days, and on the third day, we dropped the bomb. Sam had hired a forensic accountant to look into the HOA's finances, something they fought tooth and nail to prevent, and what we found was explosive. The HOA was broke. Brenda and her board had mismanaged the funds, spending money on lavish parties, consulting fees paid to their own companies, and a clubhouse renovation that went 3 times over budget, and they were facing a massive deficit. Sam put Brenda on the stand, and I will never forget the look on her face as he dismantled her. "Ms. Sterling," Sam asked, leaning on the railing, "isn't it true that the association is currently $400,000 in debt?" I don't have the exact figures," she stammered, her cool facade cracking like cheap plaster. "And isn't it true," Sam pressed, "that in an email to the board dated 6 months ago, you specifically suggested targeting the legacy properties, that is, Mr. Thorne and his neighbors, with retroactive fees as a way to, and I quote, plug the hole in the budget before the residents find out?" The courtroom went silent, so silent you could hear the clock ticking on the wall, and Brenda turned a shade of pale that made the walls look dark. We were just trying to standardize the community," she whispered, looking at her lawyer for help, but he was busy staring at his shoes. "Standardize?" Sam roared, and I'd never seen him get angry like that. "You were trying to steal? You were trying to cover your own incompetence by extorting families who have lived here for generations. You tried to take this man's home, his heritage, to pay for your mistakes." When Judge Ford delivered his verdict, he didn't just read it, he delivered a sermon. He looked over his glasses at Brenda and the HOA board members, who were shrinking in their seats, and said, "In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen greed, and I have seen stupidity, but rarely have I seen them combined with such arrogance. The plaintiff's claim is not only dismissed, it is found to be frivolous and malicious." He vacated all the liens, ordered the HOA to pay all of our legal fees, every single penny, and awarded us punitive damages for the harassment and the emotional distress caused to Mrs. Henderson and the rest of us. But he didn't stop there. "I am also referring the minutes of this trial to the district attorney's office," Judge Ford said, his voice like a hammer stroke, "for investigation into fraud and embezzlement regarding the management of the HOA funds." The cheer that went up in that courtroom was loud enough to shake the rafters. Martha was crying and hugging my neck. Old Sam was grinning like a Cheshire cat, and I just sat there, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders, feeling the breath come back into my lungs. In the weeks that followed, Serenity Heights imploded. The residents, realizing they had been scammed by their own board, revolted. Brenda was ousted and eventually indicted on fraud charges, and the association was forced to restructure completely, with a new board that immediately sent us formal apologies and written guarantees that they would never, ever touch our land again. I still see the subdivision lights twinkling across the valley at night, but they don't look so threatening anymore, just a reminder of the world that's changing around us. Yesterday evening, I sat on the front porch with Martha, watching the sun dip below the peaks, painting the sky in shades of purple and fire, and I watched my grandson chasing the barn cats across the yard, his laughter ringing out in the clear air. I thought about the letter, about Brenda, about how close we came to losing it all because someone with a little bit of power thought they could crush someone they viewed as simple. We won the battle, but the war for ownership, for the right to be left alone, feels like it's never truly over in a world that wants to pave over every blade of grass. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If a man like me, with paperwork from the 1800s and a good lawyer, can barely hold on to what's his, what chance does the average person have when these faceless organizations decide they want what you've got? Is property ownership really a right anymore? Or is it just a temporary lease until someone bigger and hungrier comes along to take it? I'd love to hear what you folks think. Have you ever had a run-in with a power-hungry HOA or a neighbor who didn't respect boundaries? Drop a comment down below. Share your story, because the only way we keep our fences standing is by looking out for each other. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your deeds handy. Thanks for listening.